Prince Arthur is somebody who hangs over the entire Tudor dynasty by virtue of his death. Even when we talk about him in life, it's always in relation to his virginity, or not. And what that meant 30 years later when Arthur's brother was trying to divorce Arthur's widow, Catherine of Aragon. But Arthur did live for 15 and a half years. And during those years, he was the embodiment of the Tudor rose, the personification of the union of the houses of Lancaster and York. And if you want to understand those early years of the Tudor dynasty, looking at Arthur's life and how he was raised provides an additional layer of insight. And like I said, I'm not going to go into his wedding and the marriage negotiations because there's a lot of that out there already. But I want to look at Arthur's life early on and also what his birth meant for the Tudor dynasty and how Henry VII would have wanted to raise him. So Arthur was born in 1486, 1 year into the reign of Henry VII, after Henry won the crown by combat at Bosworth Field. Henry spent the period of Richard III's reign in exile in Brittany and France, but he would have seen how quickly everything could change, how quickly the monarchy could change. In 1483, at the beginning of 1483, everything was pretty stable in England. The Wars of the Roses had been going on, but since the early 1470s, things were pretty much in place. Edward IV's rule was stable. There was no reason to believe that the throne wouldn't pass to his son Edward. And Edward at that point was learning in his own household in Ludlow with his uncle Anthony Woodville. Richard had been a successful magnate in the north. He had invaded Scotland, which had been really successful. There was no reason to believe anything untoward was happening. Edward was healthy. Things seemed set. And then, of course, Edward died suddenly in April of 1483. It was very unexpected. And Prince Edward, now Edward V, was summoned to London for a coronation planned a few weeks later. And that is where history changed again. Richard intercepted Edward, of course, claimed that Edward's mother's family was plotting against him, and Edward's coronation was postponed. Now, I'm not going to get into whether or not Richard killed the princes because A, I'm going to tick off somebody either way if I say my opinion, and B, I really don't have a horse in that race, to be honest. But the effect that it had on Arthur's father was to show him just how changeable politics in England could be. So Henry's watching this from Brittany, from France, and he's seeing how quickly things can change. You can have things fully set up and established, and it could all come crashing down in a heartbeat. So Henry became a rival for the throne, and the Yorkist exiles flocked to join his court, this court that was this kind of made-up court that just sort of started to appear. And Henry waited, learning about leadership and kingship, in part by watching Richard, whose administrative skills were really strong. Richard filled his leadership positions with loyal followers, and Henry saw that and he learned from that. Once Henry became king, he realized just how few nobles of national importance were personally not committed to him. He had been a figurehead for the rebellion against Richard, and now he needed to create and cultivate loyalty and prove to England that he was a worthy king and the rightful successor. He also needed to cultivate that same loyalty for his heir once he had one. Into this scene, Arthur came screaming in September 1486. Now, everything about the birth of this heir was orchestrated to be perfect. Elizabeth of York was just 20 years old. Her clear fertility was one sign that God was supportive of this new reign. 13 months after he took the throne, Henry was being given an heir. Everything seemed really great. They chose Winchester for the birth because of its history with the ancient kings of Britain. Alfred the Great, who envisioned a united Britain when he was still the King of Wessex, and of course Winchester was his capital. But also Henry decided to name his son Arthur after the legendary 5th century king who led the Britons in their fight against the Saxon invaders. Arthur's famous Round Table, a table purported to be the Round Table, is actually still in Winchester. The city itself was rumored to be one of the possible locations of Camelot. Another is Glastonbury. Probably Glastonbury didn't carry the same sort of gravitas, and plus it was a lot further away. So they chose Winchester to be the place where this new Tudor heir would be born. Henry was giving a message showing that he was the rightful successor, and that just like Arthur was uniting the British, after a long period of civil war, the country would be more prosperous under this legendary leader that was coming. Arthur Tudor was born at Winchester on the 20th of September on St. Eustace's Day. Now, Eustace was a patron saint of hunters and people who were suffering adversities. He was also one of the 14 holy helpers, saints who had a more effective route and a faster route to intercession. So they kind of had God on direct dial. So Eustace would have been a welcome protector for Arthur. Arthur was likely born a little bit premature. We can tell that not only because there was the 8-month gap between the marriage of his parents and his birth. Now, of course, that doesn't say that they didn't conceive him before the wedding, but also because many of the leading people needed for the christening hadn't arrived yet. One of Arthur's godfathers, the Earl of Oxford, was very late arriving. He actually arrived during the christening itself. And when the messenger arrived with the news of the birth, he clearly wasn't ready to leave yet, and he had to rush to get ready. So that leads people to believe that Arthur was premature in his arrival. He was christened in Winchester Cathedral on the elevated stage so that the congregation had a great view. Of course, later he would be married on an elevated stage too, so that everybody could see this handsome prince and his Spanish princess. But here in Winchester Cathedral, you have the font, everything is on this elevated stage. The stage was covered with a canopy of state, and nearby they had a fire to warm the sweet little prince. It was reported that the weather was very cold and foul, and senior yeomen of the crown had guarded the dais, but after the bishop blessed the font, the king's body servants took up the guard of honor. Henry brought together the Yorkists and Lancastrians with his own family, showing how it had brought together all of these former enemies in peace. Arthur was a peacemaker when he was only a couple of days old. Queen Elizabeth had had a rough delivery, and she had caught a fever at Arthur's christening. She had been waiting by the church for the Earl of Oxford to arrive and to take part in the ceremony, and she caught a fever then. Of course, we now know, looking forward, that childbirth would kill her on her 37th birthday, but that was still years in the future. She had very, very little time with her son before he was set up in his own nursery, and that happened around the 26th of October. So she only had about a month, maybe 5 weeks or so, with her son. And then they stopped at Farnham on the way back to London, and they left little Arthur in Farnham. His nursery was made up almost entirely of Edward IV's servants, people who took care of the young children that Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville had had. Now that made sense because there were still royal children and structures set up for them. The Queen's sisters, Catherine and Bridget, were still under 10 when Arthur was born. So it made practical sense to take advantage of this infrastructure that was already set up to handle that. Arthur's nursery would have had a lady governor with 4 female servants known as rockers. A chamberlain was appointed to oversee the other officials. Menial work was done by yeomen and grooms. A sewer handled the meals and oversaw serving and tasting the food. One major theme of importance was to take care of Arthur's wet nurse and ensure that she was healthy. She was actually monitored very carefully, even watched while she ate, so that physicians could ensure that nothing changed while she ate, that she didn't come down with any sudden symptoms and nothing seemed to bother her while she was eating. Elizabeth Darcy was the manager of the nursery. She had also cared for Queen Elizabeth and her siblings, and all of the members of the household were given generous wages, a recognition of how important their jobs were. Henry VII often has this sort of persona, there's this narrative of him that he was very tight with his money. And yet he was constantly paying these people who cared for his son on time and giving them bonuses, showing just how important their jobs were.